Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, beyond, of course, the enormous personal tragedies of the Grenfell fire, one of its wider legacies has been to shine an unforgiving light on Britain's social housing. The former Home Secretary, Alan Johnson, grew up in the slums of North Kensington, eventually bulldozed to make way for towers like Grenfell. For his generation, a council home was a ticket out of squalor. But now he says people view those in social housing as losers. And after Grenfell, he says that has to change. Here's our social affairs editor, Jackie Long.
The tragedy of what happened in Grenfell Tower is not just the terrible disaster itself, it's about how disregarded people were. We were the lucky generation. We knew we were moving on to something better. You know, instinctively things were going to get better for us.
This is where the former Home Secretary Alan Johnson grew up, in the slums of Southam Street, 2 decades before new council homes like Grenfell Tower were built to replace them.
That little block of flats there, that was there actually. That was built in the 1930s. So that and the Earl of Warwick is the only bits that remain. And of course the train line. Yeah. So, you know, the soundtrack to my childhood was the trains going past all the time. Big steam trains.
Southam Street had been condemned as unfit for human habitation long before the Johnson family moved in. He and his beloved sister Linda would grow up here in squalor.
One outside toilet, I mean there's no electricity, so the first 6 years of my life were gaslit. There was no electricity, there was no indoor, there was no running hot water, there was one sink people used and one outdoor kazi out in the yard that no one wanted to go to for about 16, 17, 18 people.
When you were running about here as a boy, what was it like?
You know, fights in the street. I remember 2 women fighting, clawing at each other in the road here as I came out of Latimer Road Station. So I don't remember it as a kind of age of peaceful innocence. And when you were kids around here, you had to learn to look after yourself. It was always a rough area, but, you know, there's no romance in poverty, but there was a community.
He says the dream was to land a council house, your ticket out of the squalor, your path to a better life. His mother Lily, a cleaner, died on the waiting list.
She had this dream of just walking in her own front door, having her own front door. And that was shared by many people here. They wanted their own front door, whether it was a flat or whether it was a house. And sadly for my mother, the offer of a council house came 2 weeks after she died. So she never realised that. And the waiting lists were, you know, terribly long. So she'd been on the waiting list by the time she died for, what, 20 years.
So has this changed much?
No. Goulburn Road Bridge is exactly as it was.
Another thing which hasn't changed, he says regretfully, is the huge gulf which existed between north and south of the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. It remains a deeply divided borough.
Would you have anticipated that the divide being as great today?
It's appalling. It's probably even greater. I mean, you didn't have statistics on health inequalities then, but now, you know, a boy born in North Kensington, as I was, will die on average 12 years before a boy born in South Kensington. That's in one borough of London. That's about the difference between North and South Korea. And so, in a sense, it's worse because of that lack of hope.
For Alan Johnson, a key part of the persistent divide is housing, the gulf between the multi-million-pound homes of South Kensington and the tower blocks and estates of the north. Not just the value of the properties themselves, but the value placed on the people inside them.
This is the big thing that has changed since my day. Now somehow, if you're a council tenant, you're a loser in life. You've done something wrong to still be a council tenant. I mean, it's terribly, terribly discouraging and unfair. And the council estate, there's a stigma attached to a council estate.
But why do you think there is that stigma?
I think it has to go to the 1980s and the kind of right to buy, which kind of meant that anyone who didn't take advantage of that, and to take advantage you had to be in the house at that time to get the huge discounts that were offering. If you didn't do that, then what, you're still a council tenant? You know, must be something wrong with you. Well, I think it's thoroughly depressing, and Grenfell in a way has drawn attention to it, not just the terrible tragedy and the fact that it shows how low in consideration these people, almost an underclass, as we were, who lived in an underclass.
You know, you talk about Grenfell being a turning point, and lots of people have talked about that, moving housing back up the political agenda. But in terms of actually building enough homes, I mean, will that ever be realised?
Not on the scale it needs. I mean, anyone who's expert in this, doesn't include me, but will tell you if you want to solve that housing problem, you need to be building hundreds of thousands of houses a year. And you can only do that by something drastic.
He concedes that no government, including his own, has built anywhere near enough social housing in the past 2 decades. But he also says building the homes in themselves is just one part of the solution. Changing society's view of the value of social housing and the people who live in it, well, he'd like that to be transformed too.
How do you change the stigma?
Politically, you can't change a stigma, because a stigma is a cultural issue. It has to be changed culturally. You can't pass a law to say there must be no more stigma about council housing. But, you know, politicians talked it up a bit more, and they weren't so obsessed with home ownership, of suggesting that the Valhalla for everyone is to own their own home. Yes, it's important, but it's not everything.
From clearing the slums to building the tower blocks of the 70s, the streets around Grenfell have seen housing revolutions before. After the tragedy of the fire, few are in any doubt another one is needed now.
Well, from Romford is the Conservative London Assembly member Sean Bailey, who grew up in a council house himself in Ladbroke Grove. And with me in the studio, Eileen Evans, Chief Executive of Grand Union Housing Group. Sean Bailey, that central point that Alan Johnson made in his film was that there is a stigma around people who live in council housing right now, and that is at least partly to do with the right to buy legislation that came in the 1980s. What do you make of that analysis?
I don't know. I grew up in the same area as Alan Johnson has just shown in your VT, and we certainly prized our council house. You know, if you had access to a council house, you felt very, very lucky. So we didn't have that stigma. And I agree with much of what he said about the social background, but social housing was very, very prized. And when you speak to Londoners in particular, they prize it. I don't get from Londoners that I deal with that they feel somehow, you know, an underclass because they have social housing. Most people really, really prize it.
Eileen Evans, do you think the right to buy created a new underclass of people who couldn't afford the right to buy?
I think that the right to buy is part of a 30-year policy failure. Right to buy is only part of the issue. Did it create an underclass? I don't think so. I think what it did was it led to fewer social housing homes being available, and so therefore people who lived in them began to be marginalised. And I think, but I think it's a full housing policy failure.
So you agree that there is a stigma?
I think there is a stigma, and part of the campaign that we and some other housing colleagues have formed called Shout is around trying to end that stigma of social housing, people who live in social housing properties, as well as calling for additional investment.
Sean Bailey, why have successive governments just failed to build enough houses?
I don't know. This is the thing about the video. The rhetoric of the Labour Party doesn't match the reality. I mean, Margaret Thatcher built more council housing in 1 year than they built in their 13 years of government. I mean, our current mayor has been given £3.1 billion to build housing of all 10 years. He hasn't done it, and yet he's asked for more. So I'm not sure why the left constantly argue for this and then don't deliver when they have the opportunity.
Well, neither
There's
side
no
delivers,
doubt
that's the
that
point.
we need. Yeah, no, well, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say the Conservatives have answered the problem, but it's certainly done a better job than the Labour Party. The coalition built more. The current government built more. The real thing is, though, we need to build more of all tenures, because many people watching this programme now wouldn't be eligible for council housing, but still have severe housing need.
Eileen Evans, where are these houses supposed to be built, and with what money?
Well, I think the government made a good start by putting £2 billion into provision of new social housing. It remains to be seen whether or not that will be delivered at properly affordable rents, which is what I would argue for. We need sensible debates around land availability, land use, planning policy, and a sensible conversation about the green belt as well as capital.
In the current political context, which is a weak government with a narrow majority, with lots of MPs who don't want building in their backyard in the green belt and all the rest?
I think the housing crisis actually is hitting more MPs post-bags than you would imagine. I think more MPs are having a larger part of their surgeries filled up with people who can't get housed and can't get housed well. I think it's solvable within a generation, which is what my trade body, the National Housing Federation,
15 years, 20 years, what's the generation?
Well, I think if we think it took 30 years to get here, it's going to take 30 years to get out. But it needs a cross-party political consensus
Sean
to
Bailey,
achieve it.
Do you agree that it's possible to solve this?
Yes, it's definitely possible to solve it, but again, your other guest is right, it will take some time. We are going to have a look at all the sites we have, look at land banking, look at how we can use the commercial sector to support the public sector and provide this money. It's going to need a lot of money put in it, but the money is there. The real pressure, certainly in the southeast, is where we are physically going to build these houses, and can we do it quick enough? But let me make this quite clear, we have to solve it across the board, particularly with social housing, but right up to people who are in employment, working in fairly good jobs, who still can't afford housing. They also need the question answered as well.
We've got to leave it there. Sean Bailey and Eileen Evans, thank you both very much.
Thank you.